Hello, everyone. Welcome to Laser Focus. This is the deep dive pop culture podcast from Nerdist. My name is Kyle Anderson. Thank you for listening. Folks, this week I am joined by somebody who I've known for a very long time. He is a fellow podcaster. He is a person with whom I have podcasted many times. And also, I don't know if I've ever told you this, guest who I haven't introduced yet. You are one of the reasons I got into podcasting to begin with.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
You know him if you he's one of the pioneers of Doctor Who podcasting, one of the early old shows. It's been on for almost 400 years at this point. Also a podcast producer of many different stripes and shapes and all that. And we will of course talk about our own podcasting history together and all that stuff. But please help me in welcoming folks. Canada's own Steven Schapansky. Hello, Steven.
Thank you, Kyle, for that wonderful and undeserved introduction. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, yeah, of course. Thank you for joining us. We are going to talk this week kind of about classic British science fiction from television, which is a very niche topic, but that's laser focus for you.
Yep.
But Steven and I are both huge Doctor Who fans, as you probably know from this show, that I'm a huge Doctor Who fan, but also more so than the new show. I would say I'm more of a fan of the classic stuff. And when I was first getting into Doctor Who in 2009 and 10, I found a podcast called Radio Free Skaro, and Steven is one of the hosts of that and has been so. And you started that in 2006, is that correct?
Correct.
You're coming up on your 20th anniversary.
It has been noted. It has been noted that 20 years is coming up. That episode 1000 will happen early next year. You say niche, classic sci-fi. Yeah, this has been my brain about. This has been mainstream for me for basically most of my life. Let's face it.
Well, because 20 years ago, the podcasting landscape was just so different. Not everyone in the whole wide world had a podcast back then. And it was you and your co-host and a friend of ours, Warren, just decided, hey, we like Doctor Who. Let's start a podcast about it. And there was when you really got going, there was only about 3, right? Something like that.
There weren't many, and we dragged our heels. We had thought about doing it for about a year prior. We actually had a meeting in a Starbucks in Edmonton, which they have subsequently changed to a different coffee shop. We used to drive by. There it is. That's the birthplace of Radio Free Skaro. I think we literally met in like April 2005, like basically when the new show was coming back. New show which it ends up itself is going to be 20 years old next year.
Yeah.
And we just we could have been even earlier is what I mean to say. And it's weird that we're coming up on 20 years. We've never run out of things to talk about because we focus on Doctor Who. There's always, even when it's not on the air, perhaps especially when it's not on the air, that's when you can sort of dive into the different dark corners and discover things and analyze things and be, if you will, laser focused on one or two different kind of things that we really love about Doctor Who.
Yeah, that has been one of the wildest things, is because when I started watching the show, it was just about to have the changeover between David Tennant into Matt Smith, and that was a really fun time to be an American fan, because there was just so much to come, and like there was so much of a push and everything. But then realizing like, oh, I have watched all of the new series, and there's months before the next season starts. What am I going to watch? And just slowly getting into classic. And folks, I will often champion physical media, as I still think it is the best way to actually own a thing. But at the time, they were putting out DVDs of individual Doctor Who stories. Very rarely was it more than 1 or 2 stories in a box. And they were not coming out in any particular order as far as I was aware. And so that was kind of a fun, piecemeal way to learn about classic Doctor Who, because there was only a small amount of it on Netflix, the nascent days of Netflix streaming.
Yeah.
And it was all kind of like bad quality and everything like that. And it's just to see where we have come now. Cause like, if you people in the US and Canada, you guys have BritBox in Canada, do you
Oh,
know?
we sure do. We sure
Okay.
do.
You can literally watch all of classic Doctor Who, even some of the stuff that doesn't exist in animated or telesnap recreations, at a button push, and it's an amazing thing to see where we came from, even just 20 years ago.
It is remarkable. I'm also I'm at first surprised and then not surprised because you said at the beginning here that I think you probably gravitate towards classic Who a little more, and I thought that's interesting because you became a Doctor Who fan with modern Who, and then went back and watched it. But then again, I remember you're Kyle and you like old
I
old
do.
media. So is that what made you gravitate towards classic Who in the gap year? Probably is when there's like the gap year specials is probably when you started really digging deep into classic Who. What made you latch onto that compared to like what modern Who is doing?
Yeah, it was sort of, well, kind of, it really just depends on. I really like the weirdly, I'm one of the few people who just likes the pace of old Doctor Who, and I do, because it was, those of you who don't know, at listening to this, I'm not sure if you do or not, but
Mhm.
it was serialized, so like one story, what we would call an episode of modern Doctor Who, was often between 4 and 6 episodes, 30-minute slots weekly, and so they could take their time and expand stuff, and and there was just like, I don't know, it's a very comforting kind of television. And I remember my parents watching various Tom Baker episodes. I didn't really know what it was, but to me that was Tom Baker was Doctor Who. And so then going back and learning like, oh, there's been a million doctors, and like, not a million literally, but um
Right.
like,
Or
oh, I've never
7.
even seen
Yeah.
this guy before. Who's this? And just kind of like, what is this? And kind of, I remember seeing um the solicit or whatever for the DVD of the Dalek Invasion of Earth, and seeing that image, that like iconic image of William Hartnell on the front, and just being like, who is that guy? Like, just
Right.
being like, I need to know who all of these people. And so there's that aspect of it, the kind of just, I enjoy old television, but also there was the collector mentality, which I've talked about many times on the show, where, well, now that I've started, I have to get all of it, either own all of it, which I now do, but
Right.
or at least have watched all of it. And it took, a fair few years, but it was a fun kind of a challenge. Um, when you started watching Doctor Who, because you're like a childhood fan of Doctor Who.
I am.
What was it, just that kind of the Tom Baker first 5 seasons or whatever it was, or how did you start finding, at a time when it was all just terrestrial, like the earlier stuff?
It was well in the 80s when I was growing up, it was on PBS stations. And even though in Canada, we still had access to PBS stations, KSBS in Spokane, Washington.
Mm.
And I just think about this earlier today. How about like I was at a friend's place and I just happened to turn my head when he was flipping through channels. I said, "What is that?" And it says, "Oh, it's Doctor Who." All I remember is a quick shot of Tom Baker walking around the console or something. And I often think to myself, wow, if I didn't turn my head at that exact moment, would my life be entirely different? And I come no, because I think I had been exposed to Star Wars, I think,
Mm.
already. And so I think my mind was just seeking out any otherworldly kind of looking stuff, and this guy in a weird scarf and a hat walking around this science fiction looking console in a bright white room. I latched onto it right away, and I imagined like if my friend didn't turn the channel at that moment, I would have found it like a week later or something like
Sure.
that. So it was Star Wars, I think, that fueled my interest in such things. um Weirdly, though, I bounced right off of classic Star Trek, which was much more
Mm.
ubiquitous because I thought it looked cheesy and camp, even in those days. And yet I found the even cheaper looking Doctor Who at that time much more endearing and fascinating to me. And I don't know why, but it was the Tom Baker episodes. It was always
Mm.
those. They seemed to be looping around. We didn't get a VCR to record things until like Christmas '86, if you can believe it. And so I just happened like they were mostly Tom Baker episodes on weeknights, and then they'd have some on Saturday nights too, and I'd watch them, and then they switched the scheduling, and I basically didn't watch it for like 2 years just by happenstance. I wasn't around to watch it. I couldn't do it. By the time they looped it around again and we got a VCR, it was back to Tom Baker. So I was always just Tom Baker watching those episodes. And and then I just became fascinated with it. And, and I'd see occasional little PBS documentaries that showed like black and white clips
Mm.
and like other doctors. And it was just another, in the pre-internet days, it was just a whole, like I just, archaeology essentially is what it was. And I just became just fascinated with knowing everything about that silly show. And that by the time I was 12 years old, like 1987, I was like, there was no stopping it. I'm not sure I've ever stopped becoming this that super fan of Doctor Who since those days.
Yeah, there was something, and I'm sure it's the same for you. Obviously, we're going to talk about old British science fiction specifically,
Mm-hmm.
but like, because I used to have that issue with Star Trek also. My dad was a big original series Star Trek fan, and I would watch it and go, this is fine. But then anything British was just kind of like, in the 90s on Nickelodeon, they started showing the updated version of the Tomorrow People.
Mm-hmm.
And there was just something kind of like, I don't know, spookier about it, if that makes any sense. Like the way that, the way Pal happened to look just looked
Right.
kind of different and scary enough to me. And also just the accents and everything. And there is a mystique to British television, which I don't think any other country really has, which is a really weird thing. And I don't really know why I think that or why a lot of people do, but there's Anglophiles out there who don't even care about Doctor Who and are huge fans of British television. So I don't know if it's specifically that, but like, I know that like, I remember when I watched the first, my first, Doctor Who episode as an adult, which was Father's Day, the Ninth Doctor episode, just going, oh, this looks like British stuff I saw on PBS. like just going,
Wow.
okay, this is what it looks like.
Right.
This is what British stuff looks like. And that's just legitimately the way that my brain worked, and so there is something sort of comforting about that versus like what is clearly higher quality, which, because it was on film for the most part,
Yeah.
American TV from the 60s. I've only just gotten into, like, I like TOS now, but I didn't until, maybe a decade ago, really.
Yeah, it's in Paul Hayes's book, Pulled Open, which is a great book about the early days of like the starting of Doctor Who, like basically from 1962 through to 63, the genesis of Doctor Who. And in it, he talks about how in the early days of TV, like late 50s maybe, like it was sort of in British culture, film stuff was kind of seen as a little more lurid and fantastical, whereas TV shown live, especially stuff that's shown live, is like sort of like the prestige stuff. So the stuff that looks like videotape, shot on videotape, compared to film in those early days was sort of looked upon as, this is prestige. Your trashy film stuff is kind of like the B movie stuff, which is entirely different to what it was. I think British TV sort of comes from like the theatrical tradition put onto screen, whereas American, I feel, especially for drama shows, it's like film. Like Star Trek, TOS looks like movies from the 1950s. Just in the way it's shot, the soft focus close-ups on women usually, that sort of thing, which what I kind of bounced off of at the time. And so it's the theatrical videotape nature of it. And maybe that's why a lot of people gravitate towards British stuff in general, just because that mentality sort of like changes their perspective of it. We're not watching something like the same kind of show that Americans are making, just with different accents. We're watching an entirely different concept of a show being put onto screen. And I think I'm more fascinated by videotape stuff because of that. I think just because for some reason, a shot that doesn't move much on videotape, you can stay on one camera a little longer, I think. Whereas if you just put a film camera in the middle of a room, it just like cut to something. Film works better when it's cut, as opposed to video when it's just like you can sort of stay on a static shot. I've thought about this a lot over the years.
I'm sure.
There's some shots in I, Claudius, which isn't Sci-Fi or anything like that, but there's entire scenes which are played out just with one camera moving around without any cuts whatsoever, and that's just that sort of theatrical approach to things, as opposed to shooting all your angles and cutting it in the editing room afterwards. And that's just a fundamental difference, I think, between American TV, including Sci-Fi, and British TV. So it's when we see some of these shows like Space 1999 or The Prisoner, which are shot on film, and they feel, or the Avengers even, and they feel like this weird hybrid of American and British that don't feel quite British to me. But the videotape aspect of it makes it feel distinctly British, because you never see videotape stuff in the US, you know?
No, I mean, it was only ever, you know, the news or like, you know, it was live broadcast. That was what video was for.
Sitcoms, you know, would be soap operas and everything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. There was, I've gone back and watched as much as I can stomach. Because it's all, I think all or most of it is preserved, but Dark Shadows, which was that, you know, soap opera, but with gothic stuff, there's vampires and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I like Doctor Who. I bet I would like this. Well, it's like, try thinking about a Doctor Who serial, a 6-episode serial that takes 40 episodes to get through one. Nothing happens on that show. It is like, it's very moody and atmospheric, but it is so slow because it's a soap opera. It can't go too far in any one given episode. So I found that really interesting, just from a, you know, archaeological standpoint, really. But I think that's a really interesting point about like TV, Britain seeing TV as a prestige medium, because it was, you know, a lot of people have said, or the reason they don't like watching classic Doctor Who, especially the earliest stuff, is that it feels like you're just watching a play. But that's why the British public liked it, is because it felt like there was a sort of, you know, live theater was the pinnacle of acting and art and stuff like that. And they used to just kind of give young filmmakers, you know, omnibus episodes or something like that to just film whatever with like actual 16mm cameras. And some of those are kind of like rough and ready feeling, like they're much shoddier, whereas the TV stuff is smooth and lit very properly. And like, that's such an interesting thing. I never thought about that. And also, like, we could do a whole other episode just about the British film industry and how it kind of went up and down, and like, even the best looking British films in the late 50s and 60s were the Hammer stuff, but that is as lurid as it gets. Like,
right.
You know, constantly going up against the BBFC for being, you know, super violent and whatever, debaucherous.
Yeah.
Very chaste by today's standards, but so once you started watching Doctor Who, obviously PBS was a huge place for British programming. What were some of the other, doesn't necessarily need to be sci-fi, but what were some of the other shows that you started to gravitate toward after you got your claws into Doctor Who?
It got its claws into me.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think I tried to get into Monty Python. I didn't. Sure. It didn't quite.
You and I have long had a discrepancy, because I love Monty Python. That was maybe one of the first one for me. But
yeah, I wanted to like it, and there were some skits that I found amusing, and I think I knew a couple people who really liked it, and I think I couldn't match their enthusiasm, basically. And so I didn't quite, although I liked Faulty Towers. That was one of them, you know, basically whatever shows were on, whenever there was like a Doctor Who pledge night or something like that, and they would have like shows on there afterwards. So Faulty Towers was one of them.
Sure.
In the 80s. I'm trying to think now. It actually wasn't until late, like maybe into my college years, when I started watching other sci-fi shows, or at least towards the end of the 80s, early 90s maybe. So like Star Cops is a show that no one will know.
I only know it because you've talked about it. That's
exactly. It was it was on BBC Two in 1987. It was set in the futuristic space year of 2027, but it felt realistic. It was basically a cop show in space. And it was written by Chris Boucher, who was responsible for some of the great dialogue in some Doctor Who episodes, responsible for all the great dialogue because he script edited Blake 7 for 4 years. And it was intriguing to me because it was BBC and it was set in space, which was intriguing to me. There was another show called The Tripods, which is based on the Tripods books by John Wyndham. Not John Wyndham, John Christopher. And that I latched onto that really quickly because it would just hit me at the right time. I think it was like 15 or something at the time, and it was like serialized, and it had like, you know, impressive videotape, video effects,
Mhm.
for something being made in the mid 80s. Like I thought, this is better than Doctor Who. It's made by the BBC. I'm actually kind of jealous about this. But those two are difficult to find anywhere. Blake 7 I had heard about for the longest time, and then my PBS station finally sort of gave Doctor Who a break because they'd aired it nonstop, and I had taped the episodes already, so I wasn't that broken up about it. Several times over, I might add. And so Blake 7 was interesting because it looks and sounds like Doctor Who of the Tom Baker era, just with different characters in it. You would be almost excused if you thought it was a spin-off, because Dudley Simpson does the music for both at the same time.
Mm.
The sets are made by the same people. There's a lot of same actors in both Doctor Who and Blake 7. But it's the dialogue and the jokes and the characters and the acting in that show that I think kind of rise it above the plots. If I'm honest, it's not the best plotted show, but it's fun to watch. So those all kind of happen around the same time. I think Red Dwarf's another one, actually. Red Dwarf
Sure.
was more of a comedy show, but the PBS station would often put Red Dwarf on right after Doctor Who because it's a half-hour comedy, and then wrap up the night. And I thought, cool, sci-fi and comedy at the same time and on videotape. Sign me up. So those sort of like all happen around the same like 3 or 4 year period for me.
Fascinating. So Red Dwarf I knew about. My dad used to like Red Dwarf. That is such a probably just a dad in general show.
Right.
But being kind of like, yeah, like uh space workers like living to, it's a it's a workplace comedy, but it just happens to be in space. It's a
Yep.
really funny show.
Mm-hmm.
Blake 7 I did not know about until I read about it, or I'd heard maybe you or somebody on before I knew you on some podcast talk about it. And then there was a book in I used to work at an old bookstore that is now defunct.
Oh.
That had a book about British science fiction, and that was one of the ones in there. And so I confess it's on BritBox. I still have never watched it.
Right.
But all the clips I've seen look exactly like you're saying. So that show, let's get into Blake 7
Sure.
briefly. That's sort of like a Dirty Dozen style show where it's like a prison break and there are 7 people on the run essentially.
Mm-hmm.
What was it about that show other than, the dialogue you mentioned with that, Chris Boucher? It was created by Terry Nation, worth mentioning, who's the creator of the Daleks, who tried for years and years to try to make the Daleks a thing on their own.
Never
Why
worked.
would anybody want to watch the Daleks without the Doctor?
Mm-hmm.
But the concept for the show feels kind of like Star Warsy, I guess, on its outset. But like, what is it about that show that kind of speaks to you? And what people who haven't seen it, what do you kind of equate it to?
It's kind of like Robin Hood, I think.
Oh,
I think
okay.
they started out as the Dirty Dozen, and I think it is because they're all sort of, well, not they're all. The Raj Blake is the initial sort of convict. He's framed for a crime he didn't commit, that sort of thing, and he meets 4 other future crew members on a prison ship heading off to a prison planet. And they all have different talents and whatnot. Like Gan is sort of the muscle, Jen is the pilot, Villa's the crook and the thief. It's almost like Dungeons and Dragons when you think about it. And then there's Avon, who's sort of the cold calculating computer expert, who is the star of the show. He is the best. Avon is amazing, played by Paul Darrow. So much so that I think Raj Blake, the titular Blake in Blake 7, kind of becomes boring in his own show, in the same way that like Luke Skywalker is kind of boring in Star Wars because he's the moral center of the show and everyone else can sort of revolve around that. Han Solo wouldn't be Han Solo if he didn't have Luke to bounce off of, and that's kind of what Avon is to Blake. And they basically they escape from a ship. They find this super fantastic spaceship and then go around and have random adventures for the first half of their first season. And then they decide, well, this is kind of getting boring. We should probably introduce like a sheriff of Nottingham, if you will. And they do that in the form of Servalan. this glamorous lady president of Earth, essentially like that, who's like wearing these elaborate ball gowns and like, has like short hair, which is a weird thing in the mid to late 1970s, and has a henchman, the guy of Gisborne, if you will, called Travis, and they weave sort of storylines around that. It's not really a serial storyline in that way, but it's kind of like that. It's kind of like Robin Hood in space, except with funnier jokes. And those are all sort of written by Chris Boucher. And I'm there for the dialogue. The plots themselves are not the best. The video effects are charming because I've seen them all on Doctor Who at around the same time. And even but Avon is so great that even when Blake, Gareth Thomas, leaves after the second year, they still call the show Blake 7, despite him not being there anymore. But Avon becomes the de facto leader of the show, even though he kind of was already that to begin with. And it was really popular. It's I thought it would be a show that was kind of like, oh yeah, Blake 7 probably was canceled after 4 years because it sucked. No, it got like 10 million viewers like right out of the gate, which might have been it premiered January 2nd, 1978, about a week or two after Star Wars opened in the UK for the first time. So prescient timing, even though they didn't make it until later. It's funny, actually. You look in towards the end of that first season, it's all like sort of like, other kind of otherworldly space stuff. It's kind of more based on Star Trek in a way, because there's transporters, because they, for the same reason that Star Trek invented a transporter, because they don't have the budget to make a shuttlecraft land on a planet each time. But towards the end of that first season, there's a big shootout in a corridor and a prison break sequence, and you go, okay, Star Wars came out, didn't it? let's do a Death Star escape of our own, which is fascinating to see how Star Wars sort of interjects itself into British sci-fi, knowing that they don't have the budget to top that, but the enthusiasm is there.
That's the Star Wars of it all. I think is really interesting about relaying that back to Doctor Who, because Doctor Who had been many things, but once Star Wars came out, there was definitely this desire to make it more sci-fi-y or whatever, adventure-y, and it had never kind of been that way before, to that extent, I guess. And then so that's really funny seeing that like Blake 7, a show that is on its face could be more Star Wars-y than anything, is still going, let's do it more Star. And actually another show that you mentioned, Space 1999, which was kind of made to be the premise of Space 1999, folks, if you haven't watched it. There's a base on the moon and then an explosion occurs and the moon leaves Earth's orbit and just starts going adrift into space with the base on it. So the moon is gone, but there's never a thought of like, well, hey, this probably completely destroyed the Earth, but well, we're off on our own trying to get back. And it's a really weird show, but it was produced by Jerry Anderson, who did all the Super Mario Nation shows. But anyway, so the first season of that is a very slow moving, very kind of cold, quite interesting, actually, I think, philosophical type of science fiction about, weird cosmic stuff, and, being on ITV, which was the commercial station. It looks great. It has a big budget. It was on American television also. It had Christopher Lee and like Peter Cushing did guest star episodes. And then in the second season, a different guy took over, the guy who ruined Star Trek.
Yep.
They cut the budget. They changed most of the cast, and then they made it Star Wars. It doesn't make any sense at all. They added aliens, which were never in the show, but not really in the show before. And it's just so funny too to see, like, because they did that with like Buck Rogers, which was made to be like Star Wars in the first place, that TV show, and then they changed that halfway through as well and made it, got to Star Wars it up more. It's just like, it's so funny to me that that's what they were doing back then.
It is, and both shows actually were sort of like were affected by and affected Doctor Who at the time too, because they aired on ITV. Space 1999 was advertised as this big glossy sci-fi epic. I think it was probably co-produced in the US, I think, too, with the money. And Martin Landau was the star of it.
It was also co-produced weirdly by RAI, which is the Italian station. So there's a bunch of Italian guest stars in it, and actors, or directors, I think, as
Oh
well. But
wow, I
there's
didn't know that.
definitely Italian money in there, which is bizarre. But anyway,
Right. Well, anyway, it was slated to premiere in the autumn of 1975, and Doctor Who, having just experienced a bit of a renaissance, so to speak, with Tom Baker's first season in the winter of 75, early 75, immediately sort of like adjusted, and instead of starting their next season in like January 76, they bumped it forward to like August or September of 75. Immediately sort of moving into production for season 13, Tom Baker's second season. And it crushed it. Doctor Who crushed it in the ratings in the UK. So much so that I think perhaps that's what led to the big giant course correction for season 2. Buck Rogers was another big glossy, American-looking sci-fi production that aired opposite Doctor Who at the very beginning of season 18. It destroyed Doctor Who in the ratings. So much so that it took a good few weeks for Doctor Who to actually sort of recover and try to, recoup its losses a little bit. And I think they adjusted the schedule a little bit so that the episodes wouldn't start like halfway through Buck Rogers on the other side and everything. So it's fascinating. These, at literally the beginning and the end of Tom Baker's era, we have Tom Baker Doctor Who throttling glossy American-looking sci-fi, and then 7 years later getting throttled. That's the Star Wars effect right there. The expectations of the British public were cheesy Wirren and Sontarans and stuff in 1975, and then futuristic space Quantel effects was just like not doing it in 1980 and 81.
That is really interesting. I obviously things kind of, but that's back to Doctor Who, as it always is. But like, that show was on for such a long time. Like,
Yeah.
it predated Star Trek, and it lasted up until Next Gen was airing when Doctor Who initially went off the air. So like, that is such a huge swath of time to be influenced by different science fiction. And that's another part of the fun of watching classic Doctor Who is like, eras, obviously Doctor stuff, that style is very different. The early 70s is very James Bond inspired because of budgetary reasons, but also like that was just big at the time. And it was coming off of Sean Connery and then going into Roger Moore. And that stuff is very evident in the 5 years of John Pertwee era. So, it's just fascinating to me how much that stuff kind of influences, one influences another, which influences a different one. And, the domino effect, I guess, of influence.
Yeah. And as much as I love Doctor Who, I don't think it is, apart from its initial start, I think, and maybe in the modern series, it sort of has this effect too. I don't think it ever sets the trend. I think it reacts to trends a lot. Like you say, like it didn't start the sort of the spy-fi thing. It sort of kind of, honestly, 1970, it kind of hits it at the tail end. Even Sean Connery's tired of being James Bond at that point.
Yeah.
And then Doctor Who finally sort of does it. And like the sort of the space opera of Star Wars doesn't really become a thing until maybe Eric Sayward sort of comes on board as script editor in the early 80s for Doctor Who. There's an initial response to it. I think if you look at Underworld, where simultaneously they're running out of money, they can't really afford to actually build sets, but there's extended laser battles in that episode too, which you kind of have to think, somebody just saw Star Wars and they want to do some of those type of effects too. There's some model shots that are pretty ambitious for the time as well. And then the 80s, it just sort of kind of plays catch up in a way, because now everyone's just sort of exposed to Star Wars, and then Next Generation towards the tail end, when, as much as I like British looking, videotape stuff and everything, it does kind of look out of place as the Sylvester McCoy era begins and ends in the late 80s. It does kind of look like the difference between that and like the fan films, the semi-pro fan films that were happening in the mid 90s. There's not much of a blurred line between those two, and I can kind of see why Doctor Who kind of faded from public view at that point, because it was kind of being overshadowed by everything by that point.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting thing, like for most of its run, anytime Doctor Who would go outside, they would switch to film cameras,
Mhm.
which is just something you got to get used to. But also, it afforded them kind of weirdly, it was easier to shoot on film back then than it was video, size of things and whatever. But then eventually they were like, no more film, and so everything is video. And outside broadcast stuff looks very bad. Where studio stuff, this looks fine. You can light
Yeah.
it, you can pin it down, like we were saying.
Yeah.
But like, even some of the best Sylvester McCoy stories, like I think of Remembrance of the Daleks or Curse of Fenric,
Yeah.
are hampered by the fact that they're shot on video. Like the fact that they are good and look good and are well directed and everything like that is in spite of them being shot on crappy old video, cameras.
Yeah, and it's like at that point, like I've watched the raw studio footage that comes on these Blu-ray sets, which is honestly some of my favorite stuff to watch because I'm watching TV being made, and
Right.
it's exciting. And in the early days, they're basically shooting it as live. Like especially in the 1960s, they would shoot Doctor Who basically with 2 or 3 recording breaks, so sort of repositioning cameras. But every time you see like one scene flowing into the next, that's happening in real time. They're actually shooting it as a live production, essentially. But by the time you get into the late 80s, a lot of the scenes in that raw studio footage, you can tell, are really they're basically shooting single camera, except it's just on videotape. It's become, because it was becoming more efficient to shoot it that way, just because they had lighter cameras and everything. They didn't have to rely on the big bulky studio cameras. And it became a weird hybrid of the worst of video quality, but also just being made the same way that films are being used and being made. And it's such a curious difference
Yeah.
in how they made things,
And you can really tell the difference. That's
Yeah.
the other thing too, is like, if you try to, especially back then when video, the quality difference between film and video was so different. Nowadays, everything kind of has the same quality, even if it's shot on film. Video can kind of emulate film in a way that it just couldn't back then. But also frame rate was different.
Mhm.
But when people tried to shoot video but use film, like single cam and like multiple edits and stuff like that, there is a jarring aspect to it, because that is not what our brain is accustomed to seeing.
Right.
And so you do get like, I expect when I see like video, it's like, it better be in the studio and it better be all shot in one. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's just, that's the way it is. And because even something like the Sontaran experiment, which used outdoor video and I guess robot as well.
Mhm.
Early Tom Baker stuff is what I'm talking about. And that, it just looks weird. It's just like, could you not get a good camera? Like, and like the sound is kind of weird because the miking is different on a,
Because it's recorded onto videotape as opposed to like audio, like
Yeah.
reel to reel tape, like or film tape. Yeah, it's weird how different it sounds, isn't it?
Yeah.
When it's recorded
It's
straight
one of
to
those things where
videotape.
like you may not notice it while you're watching it, but your brain does, and it just kind of goes, what is
Yeah.
this?
Well, I mean, the reason they did it for Robot, and I don't know why, but it's probably because they didn't have 50 minutes of film would be a lot of film for a BBC
Right.
production for Sontaran experiment. But they learned their lesson from doing Invasion of the Dinosaurs the year prior, where they thought they could put film dinosaurs on top of videotape dinosaurs on top of film, and it didn't look good. It didn't
No.
look good, and so Robot with the giant robot and Seeds of Doom with the giant crinoid, like they shot both of those on videotape because they knew at some point they'd have to meld a model creature with background video, and it wouldn't have looked good if it was on film. The film inserts, though, were a thing that dated back to live TV. I only recently, in the past year or so, I bought Quater Mass in the Pit.
Yes, I bought that as well. It's a really good Blu-ray.
The third Quatermass serial from the 1950s. The first one was Quatermass from 1953, of which only 2 episodes were kept. They were all done live. I haven't seen Quatermass 2 from 55, and then
I haven't seen that one either.
Quatermass to the Pit was spread out from 58 to 59 over the course of holiday season. And that is the prestige of production. And you look at it, it's done live. That is a live production you're watching. But they're, for each 30, 35 minute episodes, there's 6 episodes in it. there's a lot of pre-filmed stuff
Mhm.
to cover, not only to cover stuff that maybe you wouldn't be able to do, like effect sequences and such, which are a little more complicated to do on a live situation. You don't want to like risk that going wrong, but also it allows you time to sort of get from set to set basically while that's rolling live. All the actors are moving to a different set and everyone's setting up for the next shot and stuff. So that's, I think, where the whole film for location stuff and video for the live stuff sort of comes in, that mixing. So people were sort of like used to it because of live productions. And I think that Quater Mass serial made everyone realize, like, well, like, this is pretty much the tail end of live TV. Now that we've actually invented videotape, we can record stuff essentially so we can play it back, so we don't have to worry about it going out live, but we still have the complicated stuff that we can shoot on film earlier to play in as inserts. And even when they were making Doctor Who in the 60s and even into the early 70s, they were playing back those film sequences as live when they were recording the Doctor Who. So that's like on the videotape. So that whole mentality of how they made Doctor Who for the first 10 odd years of its existence basically extends from what they were doing with live TV.
Yeah, I was just looking up to see when the infamous and famous 1984 Play for the Day with Peter Cushing came out.
Oh, it was like 50
but I believe it
something, wasn't
predates,
it?
or at least is contemporary with the earlier Quatermass.
I wanted to say it was
50 something,
54. Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but anyway, so my point was that was filmed as live as much as
Yep.
possible. And you're absolutely right. Like, and the idea that something like Quatermass is unequivocally like in the Mount Rushmore of British sci-fi TV. Like it
Mm-hmm.
must be up there, because that was, it was a serialized thing. It was, I believe the first serial was 6 episodes. I think they're all 6 episodes.
They're all 6 episodes. Yeah.
And that was the first of its kind, essentially, like really dark, really a grown-up science fiction. Essentially, it's a monster movie. Nigel Neil was the writer of it, and it's basically like, these astronauts come back, or I guess they're not called astronauts at the time because it predates NASA and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But, the British space program, I guess it's called the British Experimental Rocket Group, actually, in the show.
Which is like, sounds like an awesome name for a band, but
It sure does.
Yeah.
So they send out the first manned mission. The only one of the people comes back, and he's like badly ill. And as it goes along, Bernard Quatermass, who is the head of the rocket group, is trying to figure out what went wrong and what is the evidence that we're seeing of the sickness that this guy has. And slowly this sort of like alien kind of spore creature begins to grow out of the guy, and then it ends with this huge like monster, essentially. And the fact that they did that in 1953 on television is out of control, like,
right.
And
Yeah.
I wish we had all 6 episodes to watch. They did make, all 3 of the serials were adapted by Hammer Films at different times, and you get a decent sense of what the first and the second one were like.
Mm-hmm.
But Quatermass in the Pit is both the best of the Hammer Films, which was done in 68, and the best possibly of the serials, which was done in 58. And that one is about they're digging a new subway tunnel. They find what the military thinks is an unexploded Nazi bomb, and then they bring in Quatermass, who at this point is having trouble funding his group because they've had now 2 alien invasions,
Right.
essentially. And they go looking through this thing. It's not a bomb. It's some sort of craft. When did this happen? And then it basically is like Martians came to Earth millions of years ago and maybe influenced life and created us. And it's this very crazy, heady thing about, ancient aliens, but also like what we think of as the devil were these weird little, bug monsters. I think that is one of the best science fiction, just anythings. I love Quatermass in the Pit so much.
Oh, cool.
But just the idea that like, they were able to shoot that and watching it on this Blu-ray that came out a few years ago is, I think, a revelation, because you get to see pre Doctor Who science fiction that looks enough like Doctor Who, but you're absolutely right about the film inserts,
Mm.
they were used to such great effect and also feel different, I guess, in a way. Like they feel much, they give it a weird kind of otherworldly quality, even if they're shooting on the same set as they would have shot, the studio stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Had you seen any of the Quatermass stuff before you got that Blu-ray?
None. No, I had. I'm friends with Toby Haydock, who is writing a book on the whole Quatermass thing, basically and he's all over that Blu-ray. He's he's like,
He sure
I
is.
think
Yeah.
he does all the commentaries and everything else. And so I wanted to talk to him about his book. So basically, that was like the impetus for me to finally A, buy a region-free Blu-ray player, and B, order that Blu-ray from the UK. So I know I had never seen it until literally a year ago, and I loved it. I think it was just absolutely fascinating. It was gripping and well told, but also just fascinating from a historical perspective, just to see, live TV being made and being such a complex production too.
Yeah.
For a live TV thing, it was really, really outstanding.
And like just the amount of extras they have, like is really surprising in a studio space. Like, because
Mhm.
that excavation site, which is the bulk, like the main set, I guess. There's just people around. There's just like news reporters around, and
Yep.
and like, at the end, it ends with this kind of ethereal kind of electricity being ghost of a Martian. It's a very strange ending, like attacking, and it's I can't believe they got away with that. I can't believe, one of the things I love about Doctor Who, especially in the early days, is that they didn't let the limitations of television get in the way of storytelling, sometimes to the detriment of the look of it. You mentioned Invasion of the Dinosaurs, which is a story I think is very well written and very good, but that those dinosaurs look real bad.
Mhm.
But Quatermass somehow got, like, Nigel Neil was smart enough to go, I'm going to push the envelope, and also we're going to be able to do it. Because it's television, so it's a little cheap, but I think it looks great even today. But when you watched it, did you go, oh, this is the demons?
or I think Quatermass very much is heavily inspiring of the Ambassadors of Death, both of our favorite John Pertwee stories. Yeah, it's the shadow that Quatermass casts on Doctor Who is long indeed. Doctor Who does show its work a lot of the times, and its inspirations and its resources, I think, when it's sort of doing homages or pastiches, or just full on ripping something off, perhaps. And yeah, Quater, which is I kind of like that, because it kind of keeps it in the family. You know what I mean? Like, it isn't doing in the Hinchcliffe era, the early Tom Baker era. It's sort of like is doing like old horror movies, like Dracula and Frankenstein and everything like that. Whereas this is like taking a British institution, that being Quatermass, and basically reworking it into Doctor Who episodes, and it works. I think it's especially for something like Doctor Who, if you're going to be stuck on Earth, it's the kind of thing you can do to tell good, interesting stories that just don't mean an alien invasion or a mad scientist. What if the aliens were here before us, which they've done, with the demons, as you say, with the Silurians are sort of like they were already here before us, and that sort of thing. It's an interesting and solid way to build sort of a foundation of a whole era of Doctor Who, which is what they did.
And Nigel Neil was way ahead of his time, and I just think like the kind of melding of the occult, which there's like the especially in Quatermass in the Pit, but like that demonic presence, or like holy relics like the devils and all that stuff, mixed with science fiction, mixed with legitimate science. Because Quatermass is a scientist, capital S. Like, he's not Doctor Who going, oh, I will reverse the polarity of the neutron flow, which is fun to say, but that's nothing.
Yeah.
He like actually goes about it with hard science, but the concepts at play are different. Have you ever seen the Stone Tape?
No, I know it's by Nigel Neil.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I'm the one that mentioned that to you or found a copy of it for you or something like that.
Oh, I can't remember now. Well, now you can just watch it on Amazon Prime.
It's on Amazon. Well, in your part of the world anyway. It might not be in Canada. But I think I do have a copy of it somewhere. And I've never watched it. What is the Stone Tape? And why should I watch it?
So the Stone Tape is this. It's a really interesting kind of science riff on ghost stories. these people go to this like old castle or something like that because there's been reports of, strange movement. And they have this device that can like, basically it's sort of like, those old like ancient pottery that had like specific lines on it, and you could read it like it's a record player, like, and there would be actual sounds. So it's that kind of stuff, but it's imprinted not with, man-made objects. It's imprinted sort of with ghostly or spiritual artifacts. And it's this very interesting mix of like technology, science, modern day, because I think it's, Jane Asher's in it. She was like the it girl for a long time. And then ghosts, and it's all shot on video.
Okay.
You gotta watch it.
You
simply must. You simply
should have
must.
led with that.
Yeah.
I think it was made in 1972. I want to say too, wasn't it? And
early
and
70s
shot
for
all
sure.
on video, which is like early days for shot on video, which is what I.
And it's a feature film. Like it was for television, but it was a feature film. Like I highly recommend watching the Stone Tape if you like all this stuff.
Okay.
Also, not least because it's Nigel Neil, and he was a really influential and very, I guess, grumpy man, but like, had some really interesting ideas. Folks, if you've seen Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, the weird one about the masks that are imbued with like weird Celtic evil energy, Nigel Neil wrote the original script for that and then took his name off of it.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. Because John Carpenter was a huge Nigel Neil and Quater Mass fan. He even his credit for editing the movie Prince of Darkness, it's not credited to John Carpenter. It's credited to Alan Quatermass.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. Didn't know that. All right, on my list is the Stone Tape.
Yeah, you simply must. But in a similar vein of like science fiction that is about weird metaphysical stuff, I would like to talk about Sapphire and Steel.
Yeah.
So Sapphire and Steel, starring the late great David McCallum, and Joanna Lumley, pre-Ab Fab, well pre-Ab Fab, I should say. As these, I don't know what they are. They are elements from a different plane of existence who come to Earth in human form and investigate strange occurrences, and most of those are kind of ghostly in nature. It is a weird show, and I love it. What is your history with Sapphire and Steel?
It's another show that is relatively recent. I think it's one of those shows that I bought on DVD to watch it in the first place. I've done that with a few Criterion movies. I thought I want to buy this and then watch it, having never seen it before. Like Straw Dogs and Solaris are two ones that I've never seen, and that I watched them both on Criterion Blu-ray. And I thought, okay, I've heard so much about it. I've heard people talk about the opening monologue where transuranic elements will not be used where there is life. Like, what does that line even mean?
Yes,
it's the beginning of Sapphire and Steel, which was intended to be a sort of a kids-ish mystery show from the twisted mind of PJ Hammond in the late 70s, like basically across ITV networks in the UK. And that's why I think that first episode kind of plays towards children a little bit, because kids are the main focus of it. And then the second, there's what 5-6 stories over like the course of like 5 years.
Yeah, there's 6 of them.
Like it's your typical British thing. Like, oh wow, ran for 6 years. 18 total episodes.
Totally.
But there's like 6 different stories, and is it the second one? I haven't watched it in a long time. I was taking my wife Erica and friends of ours through it, and we only just got through the end of the first season episode. And I was thinking, oh man, the story, and I was hoping, man, I hope we can last until we get to the second, which is set in the railway station.
Yep.
When it's just Sapphire and Steel, and I think literally 2 other characters. It's 8 episodes long on like 3 sets, and it's one of the most riveting things I think I've ever seen. And I don't know how they did it.
No.
And there are other aspects of that show which are just bonkers and fascinating. It's shot on videotape as well for the most part, which honestly adds to its mystery. It adds to its mystique that there's some really questionable looking video effects going on, but because the whole show is so strange, and because the characters of Sapphire and Steel are so magnetic and enticing and mysterious, it all works as a piece. It being cheap, it being mysterious, it being fascinating it's just a fascinating show. I'm glad to see like it's been popping up on like Shout Factory TV or something. I think has it,
Yeah.
and then others like Tubi I think probably even has it. So it and like The Prisoner and other shows like that have become a lot more accessible. For the longest time, I had to buy the DVD because I had no other way of watching it, and now it's kind of like everywhere. So you
Yeah,
can look
I
for it.
think I watched it on like initially. I didn't even watch the whole series, but I watched the first 2 serials on like I don't even think it exists anymore. Like a Daily Motion type thing, but it was pre Daily Motion.
Right.
That's what we had to do back in the day, folks. That was the aforementioned Ambassadors of Death, which was a first John Pertwee season Doctor Who story, was not available on DVD until the very end of the releases, and I wanted to watch it, and so I watched the black and white because that was all that existed of a color show,
Right.
episodes on a Daily Motion type site. Anyway, so yeah, it is one of the strangest shows that I've ever seen, and it does work. Why 8 episodes set in I do think the set really helps. It's a huge derelict train station set.
Yeah.
Really, really works to its benefit. It is really creepy. And there are strange, and the fact that Sapphire and Steel themselves, these weird agents, like have interesting powers that kind of, Sapphire is kind of telepathic, I guess, in a way, and sensitive, and she can kind of like read the ghosts, as it were. And Steel is much more like, he can literally basically block weird energies because he's made of steel. Like I find that stuff really interesting.
Yeah.
Also there's a lead shows up in the first one, who's this large man of African descent, which I think is maybe not the best
not quite. He sort of has like the Ghost of Christmas present feel about him.
It's a good character, but like the idea. And then David Collier plays
he who is he? Who
Silver, maybe?
Silver.
There
we go.
Yeah,
he's Silver. Yeah.
And he's kind of like the tech guy who shows up once in a while, but they're not real people, and yet they're people. It's very strange, but the fact that they are now on like Shout Factory TV and you can just watch them anytime you want to, has one of the best openings. Like you mentioned, that whole a monologue, where it just lists various elements and they all have different colors and shapes. And I mean, they're all somewhat round, but like Sapphire and Steel have been assigned.
Yeah.
Whatever that means.
It's so weird. It's so weird.
It is one of the weird, but the first 2 serials are excellent. The 3rd and 4th ones are fine, I think. I'm trying to remember.
There's
the 5th
one
one was
there's one that's not even written by PJ Hammond. I think Don Houghton, who wrote a couple John Pertwee episodes.
Yeah, Don Houghton and Anthony Reid, who used to be the script editor later
right.
on.
I knew there's another Doctor
one, which is kind of a weird like Agatha Christie style one set in the 30s. It's clearly the outlier of the ones, but
it is. Yeah.
And then PJ Hammond came back and wrote the last one. But yeah, highly recommend those. But you mentioned The Prisoner, and I wanted to wrap up because you did a whole podcast about The Prisoner with your wife. I love The Prisoner, and you love The Prisoner. What's the deal with The Prisoner? I remember seeing it like a documentary on TV about The Prisoner. And
wow.
Like, what is this show?
The Prisoner, kind of taking it back around to how I got introduced to Doctor Who. It was on PBS, I think. I think I occasionally saw the odd episode, like scene clip briefly when I was flipping channels on CBC here in Canada, like on Sunday afternoon. But someone I knew from school, I'm talking elementary school here, I think, or maybe junior high. I don't remember when it was. And he said that there's a show called The Prisoner, and it's really bonkers and weird and crazy, and it's British. And so, okay, British. You got me hooked already. And
you had me at British.
And I think I was gone a weekend or something like that. And it just happened to be that weekend, the PBS station, KSPS Spokane, was showing all 17 episodes in one day. And he said, I will tape them for you and you can have them and then you can watch that. So in its own way, The Prisoner became my first binge watch because
Mm.
an entire series was right there, and I could just watch it all. That's a rare thing in those days, but because of there being so few episodes, I was able to watch it. And it came just along at the right time when I just like I'm ready to sort of like expand my mind and think about stuff a little more when it comes to my audiovisual entertainment. And the basic gist of The Prisoner is this secret agent has resigned. He is going to go on a holiday or something, and is kidnapped by this mysterious people who drop him into this place called the Village, and it's all very weird there. And they basically the crux of it is they're trying to figure out why he resigned from his secret agent job. That is your bare bones, ground level explanation. It goes off to be just a exploration of the mind, of different mind control techniques, of interrogation, and then Erica and I differ on our opinions of the last 2 to 3 episodes. She does not like them. I think they are perhaps one of the most brilliant endings in TV history. It is unique. The Prisoner is utterly unique. Even like several shows that have tried to sort of be like, weird and mysterious. I want to say like, Twin Peaks or Lost or Carnivale, I think. I've sort of like made that their bread and butter thing. You cannot top The Prisoner. It is just its own thing. It does that element of weird 60s action plus character piece plus just weirdness from from the drug-addled late 1960s and combines them into a perfect 17 episodes. That's The Prisoner.
Yeah, it's one of the rare, and I can't even offhand think of anything like this before, and there's been some since, but that the driving force of that show was not a writer, or I mean, he was a writer, but not a like what we would call like a behind the camera person. It was the star of the show, Patrick McGoohan, was like, this is my show. He came up with the idea. He had for a number of years had done a show called Secret Agent, which I think was also called
Danger Man.
Danger Man. That's right.
Yeah.
Which was basically about a guy who was a secret agent. And so he was like, he's I think legally not playing John Drake in The Prisoner. He has no name. It's just number 6. But he had all of these ideas and everything probably from, his years of playing that character. And it's unique is absolutely the word for it. The ending is the most surreal and nightmarish thing I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it is like, and there's also the weird element of nobody really can agree on what order you're supposed to watch the episodes.
I know. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Because there's hints and you're like, okay, here, but like the way it was broadcast is clearly not right. And yet the way that they shot it was also not right. And it's just a strange, and like I've had arguments with a friend of ours, Graham Burke, about what order you're supposed to watch it in. And I'm like, this is clearly supposed to be after this. Every episode, barring two different instances, have different number 2s. Number 2 being the leader of the village at the moment, who is at the behest of this unseen number 1, trying to figure out why number 6 doesn't want to be a secret agent. And there's Rover, who is the guard. Anytime he tries to leave or run away from the village, this giant weather balloon just bounces toward him, engulfs him, and then takes him back to his house. They were doing this in 1968. Yeah. The fact that it's only 17 episodes and it wasn't even meant to be that long. That's the other thing that I think is he didn't want to keep making this, but CBS, I believe, was like, we need more episodes. This is too short.
Yep.
And so he like wrote a bunch more episodes, even though that wasn't his intentional ending. Like,
they reached a compromise. Basically, you want 26, I want 8. Let's just saw it in half with 17, basically, because they had made like 8 or 9 canonical episodes, so to speak, and then they made a bunch more, which you can kind of tell because they're never shooting in the Port Marion, the weird village in Wales, which is still there. You can get many there's always prisoner conventions and stuff going on there because it's largely unchanged from what it looked like in 1967. And so that's where they kind of wound up was with that episode title. So you could really tell like the the story thrust and what McGowan wants to say is pretty prevalent in a lot of those episodes, and maybe the other episodes aren't quite as much, but it's fun to explore that place and just that setting a lot. So I'm happy to have the extra episodes, even though they were sort of like, twisting McGowan's arm to make them.
And there was a couple that are like literally just one of them. McGowan was off shooting Ice Station Zebra, so he couldn't even be in it for very long. So there's like a replacement guy, who is number 6, but in a different body, which is a weird one. Mm-hmm. There's that one episode where it's like a flashback and he's being chased around like an empty amusement park. By some lady.
The girl who was death. Yeah,
the girl who was death. Thank you very much.
Just a super entertaining and in the opinion of my wife Erica, awful episode. I love that episode so much.
But then you get some amazing performances. Like, McGowan's excellent in it, but like Leo McKern is number 2 in 3 episodes. Colin Gordon is number 2 in 2 episodes. Then you get people like Mary, I forget her last name.
Mary Morris,
who is really a fascinating number 2 choice. And
Dance of the Dead, yeah.
Darren Morit as well. Is that his name? Darren Morit. Shoot, can't remember.
Darren Nesbitt is one of them.
Darren Nesbitt. Who am I thinking of?
I don't know who you're thinking of. Darren Nesbitt's in It's Your Funeral, I believe.
Yes.
Where coincidentally his right hand man is Mark Eden. They both they played opposite each other in Doctor Who Marco Polo. So there's your tie-in. Your
always the connection there.
Tie-in. Always the connection. Yeah.
But yeah, The Prisoner is another one where, and it just looks amazing. Like, it's such a good looking show that, obviously they had ITV money and CBS money for that matter.
Yeah, it is on film and it is better for it. I can't imagine them doing that show on videotape. I think, but they use film, like the way they direct it is so, it's just like there's really quick cuts and crash zooms and it's very surreal in its approach. It's not made to look like a standard film from the 1960s. It's just, it is remarkable. I'm glad that one is showing up too on streaming services now too, because for the longest time it only existed as a Blu-ray or a DVD. I think by A&E, I think had it out, and like that was the only thing you get for years.
Yeah, I had that set, and it was like 9 discs. 17 episodes on 9 discs. Like just the least efficient thing I've ever seen.
Terrible. Yeah, but it's coming on. I have the network Blu-ray. Of course, network has now gone out of the business too. So I cling to these physical media copies of some of these shows just in case they disappear from streaming. But it's worth watching. The Prisoner is.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Steven. That was a fun little jaunt down the history of British television, as you and I are wont to do. Just talk about these things.
We just happen to press record on this one. That's all.
Pretty much. Steven, how can people find you, your podcast, your other work on the internet, should they choose to do so?
Well, you can find us at radiofreescaro.com. That's the big podcast, of course. This, as we record this coming weekend is San Diego Comic-Con. You might have heard of that thing happening. There's going to be a couple of Doctor Who elements there. We're not going there, but we know people who are going there, and I hope to get in touch with them and give us a report on the ground to see what the vibe is, any news that sort of breaks from that event. So that's probably what's going to be happening on the next episode of this podcast. But it's the downtime. We're in between seasons, and this is when we sort of like we can look back and talk about Planet of the Spiders, or maybe we'll analyze Terry Nation stories, or fun stuff like that. And this is why we have not ever come close to running out of things to talk about regarding Doctor Who on Radio Free Skaro.
Yeah, and there's a fun element. You have a randomizer or a whatever you call it.
That's one. Yep.
I was like, wait, do we do that? We do that on our other show.
Yeah.
But where it'll just be like, this week we're going to do a commentary of Meglos or whatever, and then like let's do the mini scope is the other one where you pick up somebody who's done at least 3 episodes of Doctor Who and do like a deep dive into their stuff. That is my bread and butter as well in terms of like stuff I enjoy listening to. So if you enjoy this podcast, folks, but if you specifically want Doctor Who, more of it,
right?
Listen to Radio Free Skaro. You can also, I'll plug our other show that is on hiatus, but Steven and I do a show called Doctor Who: The Memory Cheats, where we go through an entire era. I started with you on the Stephen Moffat era. We took a pretty lengthy break, and then came back and did the Chris Chibnall era, and now we're gonna be off for who knows how long.
For
but
2
that showed-
seasons, and then Disney Plus cancels Doctor Who. It's no,
I
it
guess
won't
we'll
be.
find out.
You will find out. We're on hiatus by design, is because we will review the era after it comes out. We randomly select a story and immediately talk about it right then and there without doing any research, just thoughts and vibes of the episode in question.
Indeed.
And it's fun. I both look forward to and don't look forward to immediately getting back to work on it, Kyle. I hope that we don't do series 5 of that for several years, because it means that Doctor Who has been an unprecedented success on Disney Plus.
Yes, that is always the goal. New Doctor Who is always more important than new episodes of the Memory Cheats.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So, well, thank you very much, Steven. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about old television with me. You can follow my work here on this podcast on Nerdist.com. You can also follow me on Letterboxd, Kyle_Anderson. Thank you for joining us on Laser Focus. Join me again next week when my guest will be a different person. Bye-bye. Laser Focus is a production of Nerdist Industries and Legendary Digital Networks. It was produced, edited, and hosted by me, Kyle Anderson. For more, visit Nerdist.com.